So we figured out that an average meal of a dozen, I think it was actually 13 oysters, they were getting on an average of about, 10 million Vibrio per meal.
And nobody getting sick.
Well, no, I mean, people were getting sick like less than 1 in 50,000. With the Parahaemolyticus, it attacks everybody equally. You know, most years nobody dies of a Parahaemolyticus. It has happened. I think the industry on the West Coast called the Hershey squirts.
Welcome to OYSTER-ology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host and the food walker, Kevin Cox. That was Andy DePaola, a marine biologist, oyster farmer, and aquaculture inventor in the Gulf of Mexico. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he previously joined us to talk about some of his technological inventions for the growing of oysters on a large, even global scale with the shellivator and other breakthrough ideas. That was episode 12, and if you haven't heard it yet, or even if you have, you should check it out. Today, Andy joins us again to discuss his real claim to fame in the world of marine biology and aquaculture. That is the very important and pretty scary area of bacteria in shellfish, most notably Vibrios. An oyster farmer's nightmare, Vibrios are a constant concern for growers, restaurateurs, and oyster eaters in our warming coastal waters. Their presence in high levels can lead to shutdowns of farms, and in rare cases, illnesses and even death to consumers. And there's perhaps no one alive who understands more about this topic than Andy, who has worked for decades with governmental agencies, laboratories, private companies, and farmers worldwide to address issues relating to these harmful bacteria. So I'm going to try and dumb down some of Andy's deep scientific explanations for you, just as he had to do for me, all in the spirit of providing a well-rounded overview of Vibrios and oysters. But fair warning, this episode is pretty scary to listen to if you're an oyster eater, as it discusses topics which, if taken in a vacuum of information, might cause some to fear or even avoid eating any kind of raw shellfish again. But Andy also discusses the efforts that are taken to ensure that properly farmed oysters from responsible farms and restaurants are, in nearly all cases for the vast majority of people, safe to consume. Still, like any raw food, it's good to be careful and knowledgeable about what you eat and the circumstances in which you eat it. And Andy is here to give us some of that knowledge so that we can make healthy and delicious decisions. So button up your lab coat and prepare to temper any overreaction in the face of fear as we talk about the naturally occurring world of foodborne illnesses, cross-contamination of food, septicemia, amputations, scary bacteria like Vibrio Parahaemolyticus, Vibrio Vulnificus, and Vibrio cholera, phages that kill those scary bacteria, the importance of time and temperature, and the risk and safety of consuming raw shellfish with world-renowned marine biologist, epidemiologist, oyster farmer, inventor, consultant, and one-time Vibrio czar, Andy DePaola. Hey Andy, it's so great to have you back on OYSTER-ology again. Welcome. So last time we were together, we talked about you as a well-established oyster farmer at Deepy's Oysters in Alabama and as an inventor of revolutionary concepts like the shellivator. But your even more well-known side is as a marine biologist and global expert on waterborne bacterias, and everybody tells me that you are the world's expert on Vibrios and the impacts that they have on both shellfish and humans in terms of diseases or infections. And so first, I think I need a fundamental primer on Vibrios and what different kinds of strains of them there are, what is a Vibrio, and what's the proper way to say it?
First of all, thanks for having me, Kevin. The first podcast you did, my colleagues and friends really liked it a lot. So the name comes from vibration, Vibrio, Latin. There's a family called Vibrionaceae, and it has to do with catalase and oxidase reactions, which kind of help it in an aquatic environment. These are kind of different than Enterobacteriaceae, which are more terrestrial, like E. coli and Salmonella. So most Vibrios like estuarine or marine environments. The main difference is one, cholera.
Okay, let's start with a very simple understanding of Vibrio, because I think it's important that you know what this is as Andy goes into this discussion. A Vibrio is a naturally occurring type of bacteria generally found in marine environments. They're often associated with the consumption of raw seafood, especially shellfish such as oysters and mussels. These bacteria can also make their way into open wounds during exposure to salt water, however, because, like I said, they're naturally occurring in the water. Today, though, we're going to talk about the two principal Vibrios associated with eating oysters and other shellfish. The first is Vibrio Parahaemolyticus, which is a bacteria found in marine environments that is one of the most commonly associated with the consumption of raw seafood. Vibrio Parahaemolyticus thrives in warmer water in areas of less salinity, and if infected seafood is consumed, it can, though not always, affect the gastrointestinal system, making people sick with unpleasant but not life-threatening diarrhea. Think of Vibrio Parahaemolyticus as the more common Vibrio culprit for what we call seafood poisoning from seafood that's not fresh. Now, the second type of Vibrio, Vibrio vulnificus, on the other hand, is a much rarer but far more dangerous Vibrio, especially for individuals with compromised health. It can quickly turn into a medical emergency with the potential for severe tissue damage or systemic infections, which can even lead, in some cases, to death. Both bacteria underscore the importance of proper seafood handling and cooking and the need for high-risk individuals to be particularly cautious about consuming any raw shellfish or exposing open wounds to warm coastal waters. Now, the third Vibrio we're going to talk about is one that you've probably heard of but know very little about, and that is Vibrio cholera. It's not as much associated with oyster consumption, but it's something that Andy discusses, so I wanted to mention it here. So, Andy, how did you get involved in this world of Vibrio?
I was being in the right place at the right time. Maybe dumb luck would be a better answer. The right place was in downtown Washington, D.C. at FDA's headquarters in September 1978. I was recruited to be a microbiologist at the FDA lab on Dauphin Island, Alabama. So in the process, the registry for microbiologists closed. And my dream job evaporated, like it was doged almost. But bureaucrats are very astute and skilled at going around rules. So they said, we can bring you in as a food technologist, but the position is at headquarters in D.C. and not on Dauphin Island. I'm going like, I want to be on Dauphin Island. It was like good fishing and coast and everything. It was like where I grew up in North Carolina. So they said, we're gonna bring you on as a food technologist, but after 90 days, we can convert you to a microbiologist and transfer you down to Dauphin Island. And I said, okay, can I get that in writing? He said, no. He says, well, if you can't trust the government, who can you trust? I'm going like, well, tell the Indians.
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So anyway, I get to the first week, and my boss says, well, there's a cholera outbreak in Louisiana.
Huh.
I said, well, yeah, I heard that on the news on Friday. It was in crabs. He says, yep, yeah, that's it. So he says, there's oysters growing in those same waters, and people are eating them raw. So it turned out that the crab outbreak was really some boneheaded stuff where some Cajuns in Southwest Louisiana had caught a bunch of crabs and boiled them, and they had not eaten them, all of them. So they threw the crabs back in the same ice chest that the live crabs had been in without cleaning or anything. And then they came back and picked the crabs later on. Well, that was a perfect environment for cholera to multiply. Anyway, 11 people got sick and no one died, but we hadn't had an outbreak in the United States since 1911. And that afternoon, I was on the plane heading to the one place in FDA that had any kind of capability at all to train on Vibrio cholera techniques and become the agency's subject matter expert. So I was anointed in about a 1-hour meeting. I'd never been on an airplane before, went home, packed my bags, and headed to Cincinnati. And by Thursday afternoon, I was on another plane going to Dauphin Island, Alabama, to lead a survey of the entire Gulf of Mexico for cholera and oysters. Here I had been in the FDA less than 2 weeks, the GS9, and they were telling GS13s to stop what they were doing and take orders from me. I was the expert. They had already gone to Louisiana to some of these several different places and had already brought back oysters. So we started a year-long survey. And about 3 months later, true to their word, FDA transferred me down to Dauphin Island.
And that's where it began.
Yep.
When I hear about Vibrio, I hear about two things, the Vibrio vulnificus and the Vibrio parahaemolyticus. Am I saying that correctly? Parahaemolyticus?
Yes, parahaemolyticus.
So when you hear about a Vibrio outbreak in relationship to oysters, I've never thought of anything like cholera.
So most Vibrios live in estuaries or marine environments, and they have different species in the genus Vibrio. And for Vibrio cholera, they're one of the few Vibrios that survive in fresh water. But Vibrio cholera is also very famous because it causes pandemics. And when people started living in urban areas and started moving around the world in large numbers in the 1800s, we had our first pandemic. So Vibrio vulnificus, which kind of emerged about a month after I started with FDA, the first report, it likes a more intermediate salinity, say like maximum of 17, but it will tolerate less than 5 parts per thousand up to about 30.
So then if you have an oyster farm, let's say, that's in a highly saline area with 33 parts or whatever, the likelihood of Vibrio vulnificus is pretty slim simply because it can't survive in that kind of salinity, is that right?
No, it survives, but it's growing at the 33. It grows fairly well, that salinity, but it doesn't compete well. After 30, you'll find it, but it won't be abundant enough to make anybody sick.
So what causes them? What brings them about?
So this Vibrio has like 2 different lifestyles. Vibrio cholera. It has one like free living in the environment, but it can become infected with a bacteriophage and it incorporates into the genome and brings a whole cassette of different genes, including a cholera toxin gene, the enterotoxin. And that's what makes this so deadly to humans. So it spreads to humans through the fecal oral route. And someone will become infected with this. And what happens is the toxin attaches to your intestine, to the villi, and it opens up these channels, and all the fluid in your bloodstream, plasma, is imported into the intestine. And you can like excrete 10 liters of fluids in a single day. And you don't have enough fluid in your bloodstream for your blood to circulate. You just fade out like knocking on heaven's door, basically. And now we have fluid therapy that they developed. So very few people die of cholera now.
Now, does this happen in a similar fashion in other Vibrios like Vibrio vulnificus or Parahaemolyticus?
It probably does. It's not as well studied, and it's probably not as consequential as with Vibrio cholera. Although we did have our first Vibrio parahaemolyticus pandemic in the late 1890s, came out of either the Maldives or somewhere in Asia. And then in 1998, it showed up in Galveston Bay, Texas. And we had a huge outbreak. CDC thought maybe thousands of people got sick. And then a few weeks later, it showed up in Oyster Bay, New York. And those areas were closed down for the summer. It was strange, though. We didn't have those cases linked to other estuaries, and they never had any more cases. We never found that particular strain in the environment.
Does it travel with the currents and the water? I mean, how would it be the same Vibrio that was in Galveston that then ended up in Oyster Bay?
At the time, we didn't really understand much about transmission. The cholera are really a person to person with poor hygiene. We don't have illness pandemic. We haven't had any more cholera outbreaks in the United States since the one in 1978. But there was a huge outbreak that started in Peru in January 1991. And it was a variant that hadn't really been seen before. But within weeks, it had infected hundreds of thousands of people, killed tens of thousands of people, spread through almost every country in Latin America. But we didn't have illnesses in the United States. And there's just pockets of poverty where they don't have running water and things like that all through Latin America.
So when you hear about a Vibrio outbreak in oyster waters anywhere along the United States, what kind of concentration of Vibrio typically is something that will raise concern for oyster eating?
Oh, probably 10,000 per gram. The water temperature and the salinity to a lesser degree determines the concentration. But Vibrio is a naturally occurring. So what we really worry about is Parahaemolyticus and Vulnificus as far as shellfish go now.
When I hear about shellfish and Vibrio, I only hear about those two.
Yeah, they're both naturally occurring. The Vulnificus, the first report came out in January of 79. And at the time, there were two syndromes. There was a wound syndrome where people handling seafood or going into brackish water would be exposed. Those were often very serious, sometimes amputation and occasionally death. And then there was another primary septicemia where people ate Gulf Coast oysters during the months of May through October. And those were bloodstream sepsis, primary sepsis. And what happened is the Vulnificus would penetrate through the gut wall into the bloodstream. And only people with chronic illnesses were getting this primary septicemia. Now, the wound infections, sometimes people without chronic illnesses got that. Most commonly cirrhosis. But there was people with any kind of immune disorder like immunotherapy for cancer, HIV, and some other blood illnesses like, organ transplants, liver cancer, hemochromatosis. And basically, if you had free iron in your blood, then you could become susceptible. But it was still a very rare disease with only a handful of reported cases. But by the 90s, we were getting about 30, 35 cases a season, and about half of those were fatalities. And then later on, you started seeing it up in Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay. And basically, the seasonality of Vibrio vulnificus is now in April through November. So you really don't have a risk for vulnificus unless your water temperature is greater than 20 degrees centigrade, which is 68 Fahrenheit.
So are they attributing the presence of vulnificus now in the Chesapeake Bay and Virginia area to climate change, increasing water temperatures, or what do they think is causing it to be here now when it wasn't before?
It's been there all along. The reasons you're seeing cases is there are several. It's like a perfect Vibrio storm. The main reason is that Virginia is produced, their production has gone skyrocketed, and more people are eating oysters in months without ours in the summer. And to a certain degree, there is some warmer waters there.
I hear oyster farmers in this area saying that when it gets really warm, that's more prone to have Vibrio presence because of that.
So Vibrio is always present. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how much.
So if I go out in my water today, there's Vibrio in that water.
But if you were to take an oyster, there might not be a Vibrio in that particular oyster, but if you were to take enough oysters, you would find a Vibrio.
So at what point in time does that become dangerous to a consumer of those oysters?
So if you're not unhealthy, about 7% of the people have some kind of disorder that would make them susceptible. So if you don't have one of those disorders, you're not going to get septicemia. You could have a mild diarrhea, but those are very uncommon as well. Even the most high-risk people were becoming ill, from eating a dozen raw oysters during the, peak period, about 1 in every 20,000 meals.
Really?
And we've reduced that from time temperature controls to about 1 in 50,000 meals. So you could eat oysters for every meal for your entire life and not get it, even if you had cirrhosis. And every one of the oysters that you eat, at least the ones on the Gulf Coast, we found out, have about 1 million Vibrio bacteriophages that will lyse Vibrio vulnificus.
Okay, let's stop for a moment to understand what Andy's saying, because as scary as it sounds, his statement is actually good news for oyster lovers. Let's break it down. You've already learned that Vibrio vulnificus is a type of bacteria that naturally lives in warm coastal waters and can be very dangerous if ingested, particularly by people with weakened immune systems or liver disease, potentially causing severe illness, bloodstream infections, and even death. Andy mentioned phages before, and it's good to know that bacteriophages are essentially viruses that specifically infect and kill bacteria such as Vibrio vulnificus. Think of them as bacteria eaters. They're harmless to humans, so when Andy says that these phages will, quote, lyse Vibrio vulnificus, unquote, he means that bacteriophages will destroy the Vibrio vulnificus bacteria by infecting it, replicating itself inside it, and then breaking open the Vibrio bacterial cell, killing it and releasing new phages to infect even more of the vulnificus bacteria. In other words, every oyster you eat from these warm coastal waters like the Gulf of Mexico contains about 1 million tiny viruses that are specifically designed to destroy the Vibrio vulnificus bacteria. So the presence of these phages help to reduce the amount of harmful Vibrio vulnificus bacteria in the oysters, potentially making them safer to eat, even raw. It's like nature's own built-in protective system for the oysters against this particular harmful bacteria.
So you're eating an antidote with the oysters. So, whether they encounter these Vibrios in your stomach or in your intestine, actually, when they start multiplying. So usually the stomach acidity kills Vibrio. They're very susceptible. So chewing your oyster could have an impact. Some people just swallow. Then the Vibrio is kind of internal, so the acidity doesn't really penetrate.
Okay, let's pause again for a moment to think about what Andy just said. The average human stomach has about 1 million phages in it, which will kill Vibrio vulnificus, and the acidity in the stomach usually kills it once it's eaten. So what sounds pretty scary in broad terms really may not be as much of a risk. And chewing your oyster once you slurp it off that half shell not only enhances the complex flavors of the oyster to your palate for a great eating experience, but it also increases the ability of the stomach acids and all those killer bacteriophages to attack and kill any Vibrio in the oyster that might be there so you don't get sick. If you just swallow it whole, those acids can't penetrate the oyster as well and attack those nasty Vibrios. So for any oyster newbies out there who just slurp and swallow their oysters whole, by chewing that delicious oyster first, you get both that oysterlicious melange of taste, but you also stay safer and healthier. So chew that wonderful oyster after you slurp it off the shell. So actually, it's safer to chew your oyster than to swallow it whole
According to Andy, it is. And why wouldn't you chew
Makes
it?
sense to me. I agree.
Yeah.
What's the point of just swallowing it whole anyway? But
Yeah.
So here's the thing then. It's such a common concern around here that, everybody's worried about, especially in the summers. What about Vibrio? We got to test Vibrio. You hear about areas or farms getting shut down because Vibrio in the water and that sort of thing. And if all but a small percentage of susceptible people aren't really going to get sick by it, why the concern and why the closures because of that?
So there are not closures due to Vibrio vulnificus. We do not close on sporadic cases. Now, Vibrio parahaemolyticus, there is an acceptable number of illnesses in a certain time period. Like 2 on the same day as a trigger, and a certain number over 10 days, or a certain number in a 30-day. But by the time that gets reported, it's like weeks later.
Sure.
So the underreporting factor for Vibrio parahaemolyticus is about 1 in 150 to 160 illnesses. Most people, usually you don't go to a doctor. If you go to a doctor, they're going to give you antibiotics. Usually they don't order a culture. Okay. And if they do order a culture, then the laboratory has to report it to the county has to report it to the state has to report to CDC. And each one of those, there's an underreporting factor that grows into that. With vulnificus, I mean, you're amputating limbs, you're having a high fatality rate. Just about 100% of those illnesses are reported.
Yeah.
So what happens when you harvest an oyster with either Vibrio Vulnificus in the summertime, we were usually starting out with a couple thousand per gram. And with 12 oysters, we were figuring you're eating a couple hundred grams, about 15, 20 grams per oyster, including the liquor. And with the Parahaemolyticus, there's a shoulder where you start around this time of year, it'll start appearing. And with either one, when you harvest, usually you find around a couple of thousand or less per gram of either one of those. And
Well, I've heard a lot of farmers talk even today about the dangers of eating Gulf oysters and, that they avoid them during any of the warmer months and that sort of thing. And it seems to me with monitoring, it's probably not as big a risk as people tend to make it. Maybe that's a throwback to what happened in the past.
well, so by the late 90s, about the time we were starting on risk assessments, they passed the illness reduction rate plan, 60%. There was a committee that studied that. There was also an education committee. So they thought that they could educate high-risk people and control it through changing their behavior. And they would do surveys and survey phone. You had to make a lot of phone calls just to find somebody that ate oysters. And after years of doing this, they have found that a lot of people were educated. The problem was the question they didn't ask was, did you quit eating oysters as a result? And when they came back and asked that, no, the people had not quit eating oysters.
Yeah.
They were educated. They didn't care. But California, I think it was right around 2000, they banned Gulf Coast oysters unless they were post-harvest processed. That ban is in effect today.
So if Vibrio is detected in high concentration in a particular area, to the point where they give warnings to either farmers or to consumers of oysters to not eat them.
So that's not how we manage it.
Okay. How do you manage that?
So we had a concentration that you would have based on what the water temperature was, the average monthly maximum temperature. And then there was two other aspects. How quick did you, after removal from the water, did you get them into the refrigeration, which the standard was 10 hours at one point. And then how long after they were in the refrigerator did you get them down to less than 55 degrees, which was where they quit growing. And that could take anywhere from 1 to 10 hours if you put a forklift, a pallet with burlap bags stacked up 3 or 4 feet high.
Yeah.
And the ones on the outside would cool pretty quickly. The ones on the inside, basically, you got a 50 to 100-fold increase from what they were at harvest.
Yeah.
The Vibrio the oysters are Vibrio factories. They grow there, but they're Vibrios coming in and out. And actually, they're bringing in some of the water, but they're excreting a lot more than they're bringing in. But in general, what they were doing was they were growing on the decks of boats after harvest.
Oh, I see.
So if you wanted to get that in the Gulf of Mexico from June through September, you had to have that thing in a refrigerator within 1 hour. And then you had to have it less than 55 degrees, and the dealer had to process or had to validate their process for cooling. And if you had more time on the water, you had less time to cool. And every state could use that calculator. It was just an Excel worksheet.
I did notice when I was in Florida, I was out on a boat and they were harvesting oysters and it was all about time and temperature and how long they could be out there and then get them into the cooler.
Yeah, I think 11 o'clock is their control. In Alabama, on the farms, they don't even open up the wild reefs till middle of October. Right. And then I think they close at 11 for the wild harvest. The farmers, I think right now I got 6 hours, but we're having 80-degree days. I do everything in an hour.
No kidding.
And it's hard to harvest a couple thousand oysters. And
in an hour.
My processor's nearby, is only 10 minutes away, but it's so really what people do now is they count their oysters, they put them in a bag, and they make sure they're not out of the water an hour, and they put that bag back into the growing area.
I see.
And then when they get the 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 all picked up, and the larger ones have a refrigerated truck.
Yeah. Right.
And they hustle them off into the truck if you're going to harvest, thousands.
So they're only out of the water in the warmer air for minutes at basically the amount of time it takes to get from the water to the truck.
From the first harvest, you got 1 hour.
Yeah.
So generally your harvest window is like 30, 45 minutes.
Wow.
And so you have to have everything staged. And no, that really came into force until I got out of FDA and became an oyster farmer. Now I have to comply to my own science.
And how is it monitored typically, either in the waters or out once the oysters are harvested?
It's really the onus is on the harvester.
Mm-hmm.
You have to keep records. Or, there's a harvest report. When did harvest begin? When did it end? When were they landed? When did they go under temperature control? You sign date and all these things.
So if I go to an oyster bar and there's 12 different varieties of oysters sitting on ice in that bar, and I get a mixed dozen, and let's say I get sick as a result of it, other than looking at the tags and trying to make sure with each of the 12 varieties how they were handled, there's really no way to determine which oyster caused that.
No, you can test the leftover oysters, but you can't test the one you ate.
Yeah.
That's called a Medley. And those are very popular on the West Coast. You have sole source cases and multiple source. And multiple source can be because of medleys where you have a platter with mixed harvest locations and times, or you have oysters in your cooler at the time that they were consumed from different locations. So now we're switching from Vulnificus back to Parahaemolyticus.
Right. Yeah.
So Parahaemolyticus, there is a control. There is an allowable number of cases in this on the area, the growing area. And growing areas they're big areas and small areas. And sometimes some of the places like in Seattle, they will actually, on your bill, you will have the location, the harvest information on the oyster you ate. So in the past, when there was a medley, there was no way to count that case. With the Vulnificus, the only states that have to have a Vulnificus control are all the Gulf, Mexico, and Virginia, as far as I know, because they're the only ones that had 2 or more cases in 5 years. But everybody has to have a parahemolytic control.
Why is that?
Well, it was the risk assessment. With Vulnificus, we don't really have a clear marker for virulence. In 2004, there was an outbreak on a cruise ship in the Prince William Sound of Alaska, where this really became evident. People were eating, one oyster. So the ship, as it cruised by this one farm A, about 30 of the passengers ate at least one oyster. I think nobody ate more than 5 or 6. And one of the passengers got home and was ill, and I think he was from New Mexico. And he went to the health department, and they isolated Vibrio parahemolyticus from his stool. And then well, have you had history of eating raw seafood? He's yeah, about 3 or 4 days ago, I was on this cruise and I ate an oyster. So they went back and got the ship log, and they did a retrospective study, and they were actually able to go and get oysters, and they found the same strain that was causing the people to get sick in these oysters. And we sampled those, found just about every strain that was in those oysters were the outbreak strain, but there were very low numbers. And when we got the ship log, we found out there was like a 33% attack rate. By just going back with the people that ate oysters and reported having gastrointestinal diarrhea and everything.
Right.
And so then we realized that these strains were 10,000 times more infectious than what we had assumed on our risk assessment. And it was in 2004, there was a climate anomaly in the Prince William Sound. It was the first time they had gotten above 15 degrees centigrade, which I think is around 60 degrees or something like that. And they were getting ready to have the Alaska State Fair, and that was where about 90% of the harvest was consumed.
Oh, yeah.
And they closed that down and everything. So all this was kind of really went crazy in 2012 when we had this outbreak that started in Oyster Bay, New York. It was strain that is making these people in Oyster Bay sick, and then it spread to Connecticut and Long Island Sound. And these areas got closed down. We don't know how it got over there, but we think probably wet storage, that oysters were probably bought by somebody in Oyster Bay or in that area from the Pacific, and they put them back in the water. In 2013, this thing spread from Virginia to Massachusetts, and all the East Coast got shut down for most of that season. And in 2013, I became this Vibrio coordinator, Vibrios or whatever. So we started traveling to Virginia and Washington and, seeing if, what we could find, and went to Washington State. So one of the things we did was that during the rest season, that oysters for VP, Vibrio Parahaemolyticus VP and Vibrio Vulnificus VV would be cooled down to 50 degrees within 1 hour using ice slurries.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was almost as unpopular as post-harvest processing and everything. We got
Sure.
0 votes on that.
So when an area is closed down like it was, is it just a matter of time before they can open it up again? Does the Vibrio create any lasting effect on the oysters so that once it's closed, it's basically condemned and not going to be opened again?
So it was like COVID, so closing things down, disengagement is one thing. Re-engagement is a whole, when is it safe to start doing it? And
Right. A quick note about closures. In essence, a closure due to Vibrio is usually a temporary measure to protect consumers. If an oyster area gets closed due to the presence of high levels of Vibrio, the oysters in that area can be consumed again once the area reopens after the Vibrio levels decrease to an acceptable level. Many Vibrio-related closures are seasonal, reopening when the water cools down. Shellfish growing areas are closely monitored and regulated by state and federal agencies, and many states have Vibrio control plans that outline specific harvest, handling, and cooling requirements during warmer months to minimize Vibrio growth. Adherence to these plans is crucial for maintaining open status and safe oysters.
in Galveston in June, they had these hundreds of cases. They were closing one area at a time, and so they were not able to reopen until Thanksgiving, until the conditions had changed.
No kidding.
When they closed down the Long Island Sound in Connecticut, both in 2013 and 2014, they had to wait for the water temperature to go down to less than 15. And so there was really, there is no reopening criteria. So one of the things that has come up is the refrigerated wet storage. And Taylor Shellfish is one of the largest producers of oysters and shellfish in the world there in Shelton, Washington area, in the South Sound. But they have farms off to the Puget Sound, the coast, Willapa Bay, and even up to British Columbia.
Yeah.
So I started working with Taylor in 2022. I said, we kind of developed this test for somebody like you, maybe you could find staff to do the test at your site in Shelton. And what he was finding was that in the first 24 hours, you were getting a 95% reduction. And by the end of 3 days, you had a 99% or greater reduction. So 3 days was a sweet spot. So I think they had one case that year. They've been having like a dozen or more every year since the late 90s. They haven't had a case since then. They didn't have a case last year or the year before, a sole source case.
Really?
So they've found out, through that wet storage process that they've solved their Vibrio problem.
Is there any difference in terms of safety from a consumer perspective from Vibrio between eating raw half-shell oysters or buying pre-shucked oysters that are all together in a jar? Are the concentrations going to be higher typically in a jar with more oysters?
We hardly ever have a case. And most stuff that's shucked there's a presumption there's likely going to be cooked.
Yeah.
Although there are some people that'll put in a shot of vodka or something like that. And sometimes they put it on a shell and barbecue it. But of the illnesses that CDC was keeping track of, for every 20 cases from a raw oyster, you would have maybe less than one from a shucked oyster. So the shucked oysters don't have to have the same time temperature requirements, or if they're going to be post-harvest processed. You have longer periods before you refrigerate. And cooking is really, it's very susceptible to cooking.
That's what I was going to ask. So what can somebody do as a consumer of oysters? What can they do to minimize their exposure to it? Can it be through cooking, or you mentioned like the vodka shooter? Is there something that you can do to kill it once it's in your system? Does alcohol kill it, or is it just
Yeah, I
heat?
don't know whether alcohol kills it in your stomach. That probably, again, depends on whether you chew or swallow.
Yeah, and
Um,
the acids in your stomach are going to probably get it before anything else anyway.
well, it doesn't like bacteria don't like high concentrations of alcohol. Um, One of the things that they were finding is that these breaded oysters and frozen, they had a few cases where I think when they put them in the fryer, the middle of the oyster, didn't heat up.
Yeah.
And I did remember hearing of a case or two about that.
Oh, that's interesting. So heating at least a high enough temperature is one way to minimize it if you're eating them.
You can heat it and it still has a raw texture and it'll kill Vibrio.
So you don't have to cook the hell out of them and dry
No, no,
them and
no.
ruin.
And the thing is usually the dose that you're going to need for a Vibrio infections. So in our risk assessment, well, we figured out that an average meal of a dozen, I think it was actually 13 oysters they had done as a survey. I don't know what an average meal was, but they were getting on an average of about 10 million Vibrio per meal.
Really?
Yeah.
And nobody getting sick.
Well, no, I mean, people were getting sick 1 in 20,000.
Yeah.
And now we think it's like less than 1 in 50,000. Is if you're the 7% of the population with chronic
Yeah.
illnesses makes you predisposed for Vibrio vulnificus septicemia. With the Parahaemolyticus, it attacks everybody equally. Now, if you do have a chronic illness, it can become septic, but it's most years nobody dies of a Parahaemolyticus. It has happened.
Right. Just a weight loss program for a few lucky people, I guess,
I
right?
think they the industry in these on the West Coast called the Hershey squirts.
Other than people who, the 7% of people who have these medical conditions that make them more susceptible, are there greater sensitivities between different people? If you and I go to an oyster bar together and we're slurping down oysters, is there a difference between your susceptibility and mine to being affected adversely from the Vibrio?
I would say absolutely. Now, how do you measure that?
Right.
So whenever you've been exposed to an antigen, you produce an antibody.
Mm-hmm.
And it may have to do with your microbiome. What oyster did you eat? I've eaten oysters from everywhere. And my blood is probably the most immunocompetent in the world. Very few things make me sick. I think I ate, dirt and crap as a kid. Now, norovirus, I have had that a couple of times. The first time was at my house hunting trip in January of 79 when I came back to Dauphin Island. And we went out and cooned oysters and picked them up. And I'd never eaten them raw. In North Carolina, we always steamed them. So I said, well, I'm going to try to eat a raw one. I've never eaten a raw one. Oh, my God, it was so good. We had a whole 5-gallon bucket full. We steamed some, and my wife ate some of the steamed ones. And, well, about 11, 12 o'clock the next day, I feel really rough. I'm sweating. I'm renting a house across from the FDA lab. And I hardly made it to the bathroom before I threw up in the toilet. And before I could turn around, I crapped in my pants. And I was sick for a couple of days.
Really?
My wife, who had the same ones, didn't get ill at all.
And what kind of treatment would there be? Would it just be antibiotics or something like that?
Most illnesses don't go to a medical professional, and probably oxytetracycline is usually pretty good. But Vibrios are susceptible to most antibiotics.
So for Vulnificus, then, the key would be getting treated as quickly as possible if you think you've somehow been exposed. I don't know how you would figure that out until
if you're getting edema and you're seeing red streaks, and usually start in your hands or your feet, usually your feet, and they work your way up your leg, you don't need to go to the doctor. You need to go to the emergency room. But time is not on your side. Some of these cases, people are dead within 24 hours of eating an oyster.
No kidding.
Usually it takes about, almost that long for the first symptoms to appear. But if you've been in saltwater, particularly brackish water, if you're in Mobile Bay, Mississippi Sound, Chesapeake Bay, water temperature is in the 70s. And if you get a scratch, or if you already have one, I always have a scratch.
You're an oyster farmer, of course you do.
Yeah, you put some peroxide on it. rubbing alcohol, whatever. And sometimes, it was a deeper wound or cut, I'll put a triple antibiotic or something like that on it. But if it starts swelling, if you see any kind of red streak, you better move quick to an emergency room and let somebody know that you've had that exposure.
Now, is Vibrio the common situation globally, or is this more kind of prevalent in the U.S., North American continents?
It's hard to say because the United States is the only country that has a Vibrio surveillance system.
No kidding. I'm surprised to hear
And if you don't look for it, if you don't want to find something, then quit sampling. UK and France and Spain, the coasts are very cold there. Ireland, Scotland, and the Mediterranean is too salty. So there is a trade agreement between the United States and European Union, but oysters from the Gulf of Mexico are excluded because they say they don't have Vulnificus. But Vulnificus occurs everywhere. It just doesn't occur at a high enough abundance to where it causes illnesses that would be detected by a reporting system. Now, Japan has, I take that back, Japan has a very robust reporting system for Vibrio, but they weren't having oyster-associated illnesses because they usually eat their oysters in the wintertime when they're fatter with glycogen and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, what people do is, they hear about something that's very low risk and they get very concerned about it, like people eating oysters that don't have chronic illnesses. They do things that are far more risky.
Well, that's one of the things that I wanted to mention and get your view on because, talking to you about this, especially Vulnificus, I mean, it sounds like a pretty scary thing and potentially high risk to somebody who's susceptible to it. But in the whole scheme of things, it almost sounds to me like people here make a bigger deal about it than it sounds like it really is. Here in the Eastern Shore area and the East Coast, it's here. It exists.
So it's the only pathogen associated with seafood that kills people. It causes about 95% of the deaths in the United States were Vibrio vulnificus from seafood consumption. So we're eating the entire animal. I mean, you're eating the intestine, the entire animal. We're eating it raw, alive.
Yeah.
And so it's inherently going to be, more risk than something, the least risky is something, commercially sterilized and hermetically sealed can. Yeah. Right. We don't have any botulism, and then there's moisture like crackers and cereal and bread, but then you get to your produce. We eat that raw.
Yeah.
And there, we don't get Vibrio, we get the terrestrial organisms. But then you have the cows, there's E. coli and all kinds of stuff. And and certainly the chickens are the worst with the salmonella and the Campylobacter. But now we're starting to have Campylobacter outbreaks with oysters.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So it's really become more problematic since we started farming oysters in floating gear.
Oh.
And it provides a platform for many different kinds of seabirds, from herons to gulls to terns to pelicans, brown pelicans. We have a lot of those in the Gulf. And if you look at these floating oyster grow, other cages that you flip over to desiccate.
They're stained with.
Oh, yeah. And every bed that's dripping right down on the oysters.
A quick note on this. Campylobacter is a type of bacteria that's a leading cause of diarrheal illness worldwide, particularly from foodborne sources, and infections are most commonly caused by eating raw or undercooked food. Because Campylobacter is commonly found in the intestinal tracts of healthy birds, raw poultry is a leading source of contamination. Even a single drop of juice from raw chicken can contain enough bacteria to cause the illness. Now, while undercooked poultry is the most common source of Campylobacter infections, raw or undercooked shellfish, like oysters, can also be a source. Environmental investigations have identified birds as a likely source of Campylobacter contamination in aquacultured oysters, particularly when floating gear is used, which allows birds to perch and defecate into the water and onto the shells. Symptoms of campylobacterosis commonly include diarrhea, abdominal pain and cramping, fever, nausea, headache, and fatigue. They usually appear within 2 to 5 days after exposure and typically last for a couple of days, maybe up to a week. Most people fully recover from Campylobacter infections, which are self-limiting, meaning they resolve on their own without specific treatment. But supportive care, such as hydration and maybe some antibiotics, can help. But please note, I am not a doctor and this is not medical advice. So if you have these or other symptoms, talk to your doctor and find out what is really going on and how to treat it.
So in New York, they were just they were closing areas for fecal coliform. Some states are requiring resubmergence, and that's what you have to do with Vibrio. If your oysters stay out of the water for more than an hour, you have to resubmerge them for 1 or 2 weeks, depending on your gear type. If they're in floating gear, it's 2 weeks. And I think that's what they're recommending in Rhode Island. And there's been a few outbreaks on the East Coast in the last few years. There was one in Maine last year. Plus, again, once you close the area, reopening is really problematic, and deterring birds is hard to do. You can
Yeah.
put up kites that look like eagles, but they're protected.
Yeah.
And most of them don't carry Campylobacter. Yeah, probably maybe 1% actually have something that would cause people in, but we don't really understand what the purge rates for Campylobacter are. We're starting to understand purge rates for Vibrio pretty well. And they're very slow for Vulnificus, like 1 to 2 weeks, but they're a matter of, a day or 2 or 3 for Parahaemolyticus.
I see.
And probably the same for cholera, but cholera is not nearly as frequent as Parahaemolyticus, according to CDC, as far as causing illness.
Anything new kind of on the horizon that you're concerned about? Are there new bacterias that are becoming more prevalent that give anyone concern?
What we seem to say is when we have geographical expansion, like Vibrio parahaemolyticus in Alaska, that those tend to be more infectious than they are in areas where they're more endemic. And then we have new variants like the pandemic strain, which apparently had a much higher attack rate than other Vibrio parahaemolyticus. And we really, when we discovered Vibrio cholera, it was the Latin American strain in ballast water coming into Mobile Bay. They started implementing double exchange of sea and ballast purification systems and everything. Yeah, and then zebra mussels, it's not just pathogens. There's all these other exotic marine organisms that get moved around the globe in ballast water and everything. But I think that we've learned how with better practices how to manage these. As an oyster farmer, I really worry that somebody will eat an oyster that shouldn't eat an oyster. And I'll have the same right place, right time thing that made me the Vibrio cholera expert in 1978. That will be the first oyster farm on the Gulf of Mexico associated with the Vulnificus case. As far as I know, and CDC and FDA has quit communicating with anybody right now since the new administration came in. But as far as tracking Vulnificus, they've quit doing that for the last decade. I would say there's been at least a 60% reduction. And it may be a lot more than that because a lot of the raw consumption has shifted from the Gulf Coast to the Atlantic and Pacific coast. But, my fear is even though I've done everything right, I don't have a zero risk.
You can only control your handling and processing and managing of the oysters themselves, but once they leave your hands and somebody consumes it who's susceptible, there's not much.
I would say in general, dealers are very astute. And since they've adopted the risk calculator and everything, they have records. It's hard for a restaurant to mess up bad enough to allow Vibrio to grow much. Because, if you heat it up to 70 degrees, you're going to reduce the shelf life. Even if you take it out of the refrigerator, chuck and put it back and forth, there's a lag period, of an hour or so before it even starts multiplying from when it's been cooled down.
Well, listen, Andy, I can't thank you enough for the time you've given me, and you have taught me more than I ever thought I would know about Vibrios and related things, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I hope you didn't have to dumb it down for me too much, but I really appreciate your time and your effort.
Well, I appreciate you, reaching out. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Andy for helping shed some light on the scary topic of Vibrio bacteria and eating raw oysters. As we tried to show throughout our conversation, knowledge is power, and understanding the risks and realities of Vibrios and oysters enables us to make logical decisions. Even with the scary information in mind, it's important to keep things in perspective. In this case, balancing the understanding that while the risk of illness when eating some oysters in certain areas is very real, it is also very small, and the likelihood for most people of getting sick is rare. Still, understanding Vibrios and the waterborne bacteria is important to understand oysters and the healthy, safe, and highly regulated food source that it is today. Also, it's really important to emphasize that nothing in this episode is intended to be medical advice or assurances as to the safety of eating raw oysters. You may be asking yourself, will these risks of Vibrio now keep me from continuing to devour oysters on the half-shell whenever given the opportunity? For me, the answer is resounding. Absolutely not. The risks are very small and vastly outweighed by the significant health benefits, deliciousness, and joy of raising a cold, fresh oyster dancing in its own clear, pristine liquor in the iridescent cup of its shell to my lips and sliding it in. So like so many other things we eat and enjoy, I conclude that eating properly grown fresh raw oysters is low risk, though not always no risk. And that tiny risk is one that I'm willing to take. Well, that's it for this episode of Oyster-ology. Thanks again to my guest, Andy DePaola. Links to various websites dealing with bacteria and oysters are included in the show notes along with a transcript of this episode, so be sure to check it out. If you like this episode or want to say anything about it, please leave a comment to let me know. I swear I read every one. And please follow and like Oyster-ology whenever you listen to podcasts. The more favorable reviews and followers we get, the more others will discover us too. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to join us again next time when we pry open the shell of another interesting Oyster-ology topic.